In rural Pennsylvania, at the annual Hartwell family reunion, a 78-year-old woman was about to face devastating public humiliation. What started as a peaceful weekend gathering took a shocking turn when her great-nephew's cruelty came face-to-face with hidden truth. Aliana Milestonebrown wasn't your typical retired teacher. For 40 years, she had served as a federal judge, known for her unwavering integrity and constitutional expertise. When her great-nephew Marcus publicly mocked her dead-end government job in front of his most important client, she had no idea she was walking into an ethical crisis. Aliana's dignified silence would lead to the most dramatic revelation in family history. What began as enduring, condescending remarks would become a masterclass in real versus assumed power. The family would never be the same after discovering their humble relative was actually one of the country's most respected federal judges. And Marcus's client was scheduled to appear before her bench Monday morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Aliana Milestonebrown adjusted her reading glasses and checked her watch, a modest Timex that had served her faithfully for 20 years, as David pulled their well-maintained but unremarkable Honda Civic into the circular driveway of Eleanor Hartwell's sprawling farmhouse. At 78, Aliana moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. But her dark eyes remained sharp behind her wire-rimmed glasses, missing nothing as she surveyed the familiar scene. "Same as every year," she murmured to David, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came with age, but losing none of its authority. "Eleanor's got the front porch decorated like something out of a magazine, and I can already smell her pot roast from here." David Chang, now in his early 50s and still her devoted husband after 15 years of marriage, smiled as he turned off the engine. "You sure you don't want to tell them this year, Aliana, about what you really do?" His voice carried the gentle concern of someone who'd watched his wife deflect questions about her career for over a decade of family gatherings. Aliana's weathered hand found his, her fingers still strong despite the arthritis that made winter mornings challenging. "David, we've discussed this. The moment they know I'm a federal judge, everything changes. Suddenly, I'm not just Aunt Aliana anymore. I'm the famous one, the important one. People start walking on eggshells, choosing their words carefully." She gestured toward the farmhouse, where figures were already appearing on the porch. "Look at them. They're happy to see us because we're family, not because of what I do for a living." "But Marcus," David began. "Will be Marcus," Aliana finished firmly. "My great-nephew has always been full of himself, and that's not going to change whether I'm a retired teacher or a federal judge. At least, this way, I get to see who he really is when he thinks he's talking to someone unimportant." Eleanor Hartwell emerged from the front door like a force of nature, her silver hair perfectly styled despite having spent the morning cooking, her face lighting up with genuine joy at the sight of their arrival. At 78, Eleanor moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been managing family gatherings for decades, her apron already dusted with flour for the evening's dinner preparations. "Aliana! David!" Eleanor's voice carried across the yard as she hurried down the porch steps, her arms already extended for hugs. "You made such good time. How was the drive from Philadelphia?" Aliana allowed herself to be enveloped in Eleanor's enthusiastic embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon that always clung to her great-niece during reunion weekends. "Traffic wasn't too bad for a Friday afternoon, though David insisted we stop every hour so I could stretch these old bones." "Smart man," Eleanor laughed as she reached up to hug David as well. "At our age, we have to be practical about these things. Come on, let's get you settled. Marcus called an hour ago. He's running late, but he should be here in time for dinner, and he's bringing a surprise guest." Uncle Frank Hartwell rounded the corner of the house, his weathered hands still holding the garden hose that he had been using to water Eleanor's prized rose bushes. At 73, Frank remained Eleanor's stalwart brother-in-law, the steady presence who kept family gatherings grounded in their working-class roots. His keen blue eyes took in Aliana's sensible traveling clothes and comfortable walking shoes with the approval of someone who valued substance over style. "Aliana," he nodded, his greeting warm but not effusive. "Good to see you looking well. Retirement treating you right?" This was the moment that always tested Aliana's carefully constructed facade. Frank's question carried the weight of genuine concern. He believed, like the rest of the family, that she'd retired from her teaching job 3 years ago and was now living quietly on her pension. The truth was more complicated. At 78, she remained an active federal judge, her mind as sharp as ever, presiding over some of the most complex cases in the Philadelphia federal court system. "Oh, you know how it is," Aliana replied with practiced vagueness, her tone suggesting mild contentment rather than the intellectual vigor that still drove her to work 60-hour weeks. "Sometimes the quiet life is the best life," he said, though his eyes held a glimmer that suggested he suspected there was more to Aliana's story. As they moved toward the house, Eleanor, chattering about the weekend's planned activities and who else had already arrived, Aliana caught sight of Jessica Hartwell through the kitchen window. Marcus's wife was setting the dining room table with Eleanor's good china, her movements efficient, but somehow tense. Even from a distance, Aliana could read the subtle signs of stress in Jessica's posture. The slightly rigid set of her shoulders, the way she handled the delicate plates with just a little too much care. "Jessica looks tired," Aliana observed quietly to David as they climbed the porch steps. "Marcus has been working her pretty hard on the social circuit," Eleanor replied, overhearing. "Big corporate events, client dinners. She says it's part of the job, but I worry she doesn't get enough time for herself." Aliana filed this information away with the automatic precision of someone trained to notice details that others might miss. In her years on the bench, she had learned to read people's stress levels, to spot the signs of lives lived under pressure. Jessica's tension suggested that Marcus's successful law practice came with costs that weren't immediately visible. David carried their modest luggage up to the guest room they'd occupied for the past several reunions, a cozy space under the eaves with a view of the back pasture where Eleanor's neighbors' horses grazed peacefully. The room's simple furnishings and handmade quilts spoke of comfort rather than luxury, and Aliana felt herself relaxing into the familiar surroundings. "You know, David," said Aliana. "You know, David," said quietly. "You know, David," said quietly as he set their suitcases on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. "I love watching you here. You become someone different, somehow, softer." Aliana caught sight of herself in the mirror above the antique dresser. In her comfortable traveling clothes and sensible walking shoes, with her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, she looked exactly like what the family believed her to be, a retired teacher, living modestly on her pension, grateful for family gatherings that brought excitement to her quiet life. The truth was far more complex. On Monday morning, she would return to Philadelphia and don her judicial robes, presiding over federal cases that would shape legal precedent for decades to come. Her calendar was packed with complex litigation, her chambers filled with law clerks seeking her guidance on constitutional interpretation. She was, by any measure, one of the most influential jurists in the Third Circuit. But here, in this bedroom with its faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards, she was simply Aunt Aliana, someone to be humored and included, but not necessarily taken seriously. Someone whose opinions on family matters were welcomed, but whose professional life was assumed to be safely in the past.
"I like being underestimated," she admitted to David, settling into the room's single armchair to rest her feet. "There's a freedom in it. People show you who they really are when they think you don't matter professionally." From downstairs came the sound of car doors slamming and Marcus's booming voice announcing his arrival. Through the window, Aliana could see a gleaming black Tesla pulling into the driveway, its chrome wheels catching the late afternoon sun like scattered coins. "Showtime," David murmured, and Aliana smiled at the familiar ritual about to begin. Marcus would make his grand entrance, displaying his success like a peacock showing its plumage, and she would play her role as the quietly proud great-aunt, impressed by his achievements and grateful for his attention. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Aliana had spent her career dealing with men exactly like him. Corporate lawyers whose confidence often exceeded their competence, who measured worth by billable hours and client lists rather than justice served or principles upheld. This weekend, like all the others, would test her ability to remain silent while her great-nephew performed his superiority. The difference was, this time felt different somehow. At 78, Aliana found herself wondering how much longer she could maintain the charade, and whether the cost of keeping peace was finally becoming too high to bear. Outside, Marcus's voice grew louder as he greeted the family, and Aliana steeled herself for another performance of deliberate insignificance. Marcus's hand swept dramatically toward the gleaming Tesla as he stepped out, his movements calculated for maximum impact. Even from the guest room window, Aliana could see the performance beginning, the way he straightened his Italian suit jacket, the practiced pause as he surveyed the farmhouse with the air of someone returning to quaint but humble origins. "Richard," Marcus's voice carried easily across the yard, projecting with the practiced authority of a courtroom attorney. "Welcome to the Hartwell family circus. Fair warning, they're going to want to feed you until you can't move, and they'll ask approximately 1,000 questions about your business." The passenger door opened to reveal Richard Chen, a man in his early 60s who moved with the calculated grace of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His understated Brioni suit and Patek Philippe watch spoke of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Yet something in his posture suggested a man carrying invisible weight. Aliana watched from behind the guest room's lace curtains as the family gathered on the front porch like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Eleanor emerged first, naturally, her face bright with maternal pride at her son's arrival. Uncle Frank followed more slowly, his weathered hands still holding the garden hose, his expression carefully neutral as he assessed the expensive car and its occupants. "Everyone!" Marcus called out with the commanding presence that had made him successful in corporate law. "I'd like you to meet Richard Chen. He's one of my most important clients, runs the most successful development company on the East Coast." Aliana's judicial training kicked in automatically, cataloging details. Chen's handshake with Eleanor was firm but brief, his smile polite but measured. There was something practiced about his charm, the way he seemed to assess each family member while appearing genuinely interested in their rural gathering. "Mrs. Hartwell," Chen said, his voice carrying the faint trace of a first-generation accent. "I hope I'm not imposing by joining you." "Nonsense," Eleanor beamed, already mentally rearranging dinner portions and sleeping arrangements. "Any friend of Marcus's is family. Come in, come in." David touched Aliana's shoulder gently. "Ready for the show?" he murmured, and she could hear the protective edge in his voice that always emerged during these family gatherings. "As ready as one can be," Aliana replied, rising from the armchair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested sudden motion. "Let's go see what young Marcus has planned for us this time." They made their way downstairs as Marcus continued his tour guide performance, gesturing toward various aspects of the farmhouse as if explaining historical artifacts to a museum visitor. "The house has been in the family for 3 generations," he was saying to Chen, his tone carrying that particular mixture of affection and condescension that suggested he'd outgrown such simple pleasures. "Aunt Aliana!" Marcus's voice boomed as she appeared on the porch, his arms spreading wide in a gesture of theatrical enthusiasm. "There's my favorite retired teacher. Still reading those mystery novels?" The comment was designed to sound affectionate, but Aliana caught the subtle patronizing, the way he'd reduced her life to stereotypical retiree pastimes, the assumption that her days were filled with gentle hobbies, rather than anything of consequence. "Among other things," Aliana replied, mildly, extending her hand to Chen with the dignified grace of someone comfortable in any social situation. "Mr. Chen, welcome to our family gathering. Marcus speaks of you often." Chen's grip was firm, his assessment swift but thorough. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Milestonebrown. Aliana Milestonebrown. And this is my husband, David." Aunt Aliana taught high school English for 40 years, retired 3 years ago. Now she spends her time with book clubs and volunteer work, living the peaceful life we all dream about, right, Aunt Aliana? The words carried that particular brand of kindness that felt more like dismissal, the way one might speak about a beloved pet's simple pleasures. Aliana felt David's subtle tension beside her, but maintained her serene expression. "Retirement has its rewards," she said carefully, the phrase deliberately vague enough to encompass both the fiction Marcus believed and the reality of her continued judicial service. Chen nodded politely, but Aliana caught something in his expression, a flicker of assessment that suggested he found something intriguing about her measured responses. She filed this observation away, wondering what exactly had brought Marcus's client to a family reunion. "Richard is facing some challenging business situations," Marcus continued, his chest expanding slightly with the importance of representing such a significant client. "Federal regulatory issues, you know how it is. Nothing my team can't handle, of course, but it's complex work, the kind of thing that requires real expertise in corporate law." Something in Chen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of federal issues, but he recovered quickly. "Marcus has been invaluable," he said smoothly, "though I have to admit I'm looking forward to a weekend away from legal concerns." As they moved toward the dining room, Marcus continued his performance, positioning himself as the family's bridge between their simple rural life and the sophisticated world of corporate success. He guided Chen through the familiar rooms like a diplomat introducing foreign dignitaries to local customs, his tone suggesting benevolent tolerance for the quaint family traditions he'd clearly outgrown. Jessica appeared from the kitchen, her auburn hair perfectly styled despite the day's heat, her smile bright, but somehow strained. She moved to Marcus's side with practiced ease, though Aliana noticed the slight tension in her posture that spoke of someone managing multiple social pressures. "Richard, I'm so glad Marcus finally brought you to meet us," Jessica said, her voice carrying the warm professionalism of someone who'd spent years managing her husband's business relationships. "Though I warn you, Eleanor's cooking is dangerous. You'll never want to leave." Amy Chan emerged behind her father, and Aliana found herself genuinely curious about this young woman who'd chosen to accompany her father to a stranger's family reunion. There was something in Amy's quiet observation of the family dynamics that suggested intelligence and perhaps discomfort with whatever had brought her here. As Eleanor called them to dinner, Aliana took her usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot traditionally reserved for elderly relatives, where she could observe without being central to the conversation. From this vantage point,
She watched Marcus orchestrate the evening's performance, positioning himself as the successful family representative while subtly differentiating himself from his family's traditions.
Diminishing everyone else's accomplishments. The real show, she knew, was just beginning. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Hartwell family's traditional Saturday barbecue, turning Uncle Frank's carefully maintained lawn into a patchwork of shade seekers and sun worshippers. Aliana had positioned herself strategically in one of Eleanor's cushioned lawn chairs beneath the old oak tree, her wide-brimmed sun hat providing additional protection while giving her an unobstructed view of the family dynamics playing out across the yard. At 78, she'd learned to pace herself during these gatherings, conserving energy for the moments that mattered most. David hovered nearby, ostensibly engaged in Frank's detailed explanation of his new irrigation system, but Aliana could feel his protective attention like a warm current in the cooling air. Marcus held court near the barbecue grill, his expensive polo shirt and designer khakis somehow managing to look perfectly pressed despite the heat. He'd positioned himself where his voice would carry to every corner of the gathering, regaling Richard Chen and anyone else within earshot with stories of his latest legal victories. "The thing about federal regulations," Marcus was saying, gesturing with his craft beer like a conductor's baton, "is that they're written by people who've never actually run a business. Academics and bureaucrats who think the real world operates like their textbooks." Chen nodded politely, though Aliana noticed his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "It can be challenging to navigate," he agreed carefully. "That's why you need someone who understands how things actually work," Marcus continued, his chest expanding with self-importance. "Someone who can speak the language of both worlds, business and law. It's not something you can learn from books alone." From her chair, beneath the oak tree, Aliana watched Amy Chen's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. The young woman had been quiet most of the day, observing the family dynamics with the careful attention of someone trying to understand new territory. Now she looked distinctly uncomfortable with the direction of her father and Marcus's conversation. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, carrying a platter of her famous potato salad, her face flushed from the heat of cooking, but glowing with the satisfaction of feeding her family. "Marcus, honey, could you help me with the rest of the side dishes? There's too much for these old hands to manage." "Of course, Wom," Marcus replied, but not before finishing his thought. "The problem with the education system is that it produces people who think theory equals reality. 40 years of teaching high school kids about literature isn't exactly preparation for understanding complex business law, you know?" The comment seemed casual, almost throwaway, but Aliana felt its sting. David's hands stilled on the garden hose he'd been helping Frank coil, and Uncle Frank's weathered face darkened several shades. "Education has its value," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 3 children on a machinist's wages while respecting the teachers who'd shaped their minds. Marcus laughed, the sound carrying across the yard like the crack of a whip. "Oh, absolutely. I didn't mean to suggest teaching isn't important. It's just, well, let's be honest about the scope of impact, right? Aunt Aliana spent 40 years teaching teenagers about Shakespeare and grammar. Very valuable, very necessary work. But when you're dealing with federal investigations, SEC compliance, complex corporate litigation, he shrugged with practiced nonchalance. It's just a different league entirely." Jessica appeared at his husband's elbow, her perfectly manicured hands gripping a serving bowl with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that only a spouse would recognize. But Marcus was in full flow now, energized by what he clearly saw as an appreciative audience in Richard Chen.
I mean, no offense to retired teachers everywhere, but there's a reason the phrase, those who can do, those who can't teach, exists. It's not that teaching is bad, it's that it's safe, predictable. You show up, you follow the curriculum, you collect your pension. Not exactly the kind of experience that prepares you for high-stakes decision-making. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Even the children playing cornhole at the far end of the yard seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their laughter becoming more subdued. Aliana felt the familiar burn of injustice that had driven her through law school, through her early years as a prosecutor, through the confirmation hearings for her federal appointment. Here was her great-nephew, a man whose legal career she could have built or destroyed with a single phone call, dismissing not just her supposed profession, but her entire life's work as inconsequential. The irony was bitter as medicinal herbs. In her chambers, she regularly presided over cases involving the exact kind of corporate malfeasance that Marcus specialized in defending. She'd sent white-collar criminals to federal prison, dismantled fraudulent schemes, and handed down precedent-setting decisions that shaped business law across the circuit. Yet here she sat, dismissed as a harmless old woman whose contributions to society were quaint but ultimately meaningless. David's jaw had tightened to the point where Aliana worried he might crack a tooth. She placed a gentle, restraining hand on his arm, feeling the tension thrumming through his muscles like a taut wire. Teaching shaped minds that went on to build this country, Aliana said, her voice clear and steady. Now I know you know there's no need to diminish everyone else's accomplishments. The real show, she knew, was just beginning.
But she was alone in her knowledge of just how wrong Marcus actually was, and that, perhaps, was the heaviest burden of all. Aliana climbed the narrow staircase to the guest room with deliberate steps, her hand gripping the polished banister that had supported 3 generations of Hartwell family members. At 78, she'd learned to read her body's signals, the tightness in her chest that spoke of rising blood pressure, the slight tremor in her hands that appeared when her legendary judicial composure was being tested beyond its limits. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The guest room felt like a sanctuary after the suffocating performance downstairs. She sank into the faded armchair by the window, removed her sun hat, and allowed herself a moment of unguarded exhaustion. Through the thin walls, she could hear Marcus's voice continuing its assault on the afternoon air, holding forth on subjects he believed he understood better than anyone else present. David appeared in the doorway minutes later, carrying 2 glasses of Eleanor's sweet tea, his face set in the grim lines of someone exercising extraordinary restraint. He closed the door behind him with the soft click of someone seeking privacy in a house full of listening ears. "Aliana," he said quietly, settling into the room's single chair across from her. "I watched you during that whole performance down there. Your face," he shook his head, "I haven't seen you that angry since the Morrison case." The Morrison case. Aliana closed her eyes briefly, remembering the corporate executive who'd stood before her bench 2 years ago, smugly confident that his team of expensive lawyers could manipulate the system to his advantage. She'd sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison for securities fraud, and his shocked expression when the gavel fell had been worth every moment of his earlier arrogance. "The difference," Aliana said carefully, accepting the glass of tea with hands that still trembled slightly, "is that in my courtroom, I have the authority to stop that kind of behavior. Here," she gestured toward the window, where Marcus's voice continued its relentless self-promotion, "here, I'm just a harmless old woman who should be grateful for his attention." David leaned forward, his expression intense. "Then tell them. Today, right now, Walk down those stairs and explain exactly who you are and what you do. Watch that pompous little peacock deflate when he realizes he's been lecturing one of the most respected federal judges in the Third Circuit. Aliana felt the temptation like a physical pull. The image of Marcus's face when he learned the truth was almost irresistibly satisfying. And then what, David? Then I become the famous relative, the one everyone has to be careful around. Eleanor starts apologizing for not recognizing my importance. Uncle Frank feels diminished because he never knew. Jessica starts treating me like visiting royalty instead of family. And Marcus learns some humility, David said firmly. That man needs to understand that the world doesn't revolve around corporate law and billable hours. From downstairs came the sound of voices, not the convivial gathering of earlier, but something more strained. Aliana could distinguish Jessica's voice, unusually sharp, and Marcus's responding with the defensive tone he'd perfected during their childhood disagreements. I should check on, David began, but Aliana held up a restraining hand. Let them work it out, she said softly. Jessica's a smart woman. She's been watching this performance as long as we have. Indeed, through the thin floors, they could hear the conversation escalating. Jessica's voice carried more clearly now, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of public embarrassment. Treating your own family like they're beneath you, Jessica was saying, her words sharp enough to cut through Marcus's usual deflections. She's 78 years old, Marcus. She's earned some respect. I was being affectionate, Marcus protested, his tone suggesting he genuinely didn't understand the problem. Aunt Aliana knows I care about her. I was just explaining to Richard how different our professions are. You were condescending and cruel, and everyone could see it. Aliana found herself grudgingly impressed with Jessica's backbone. The younger woman had spent years smoothing over Marcus's social missteps, playing the perfect corporate wife. This public confrontation suggested reserves of strength that perhaps even Jessica herself hadn't known she possessed. You're overreacting, Marcus said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had become his default setting. Richard understands the realities of professional hierarchies. Teaching is teaching, law is law. I wasn't insulting anyone. Then you're more oblivious than I thought. The conversation moved away from the directly beneath them, but Aliana could still hear the tension in their voices as they continued their disagreement in the kitchen. Other family members seemed to be giving them space, though she caught fragments of Uncle Frank's voice speaking quietly with Eleanor near the back porch. Frank's talking sense into Eleanor, David observed, his ear also tuned to the household dynamics. He's been watching Marcus's behavior all day, and he's not impressed. Through the window, Aliana could see Amy Chen sitting alone at the picnic table, her father having retreated to take what looked like a business call near the barn. The young woman's posture spoke of deep discomfort, and she kept glancing toward the house with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering her decision to attend this family gathering. That poor girl, Aliana murmured. Whatever her father's business troubles are, she's clearly not comfortable with them. David followed her gaze. Richard Chen has been nervous all day. Every time someone mentions regulatory compliance or law enforcement, he gets this look. David paused, his prosecutor's instincts clearly engaged. Aliana, what if Chen's legal troubles are more serious than Marcus realizes? What if he's not just dealing with regulatory compliance, but actual criminal charges? The possibility sent a chill through Aliana's chest. In her years on the federal bench, she'd seen dozens of wealthy businessmen who'd convinced themselves that expensive lawyers could protect them from the consequences of their actions. If Chen was facing federal prosecution, David, she said slowly, what are the chances that Marcus would bring a client to a family gathering without fully understanding the scope of his legal problems?
Given Marcus's ego and his apparent blindness to anything that doesn't directly enhance his reputation, David's expression was grim. I'd say pretty high. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Aunt Aliana? Amy Chen's voice came through the door, tentative but determined. Could I speak with you for a moment? Aliana and David exchanged glances. Of course, dear, Aliana called. Come in. Amy entered with the careful movements of someone entering unfamiliar territory. Her earlier polished composure had given way to something more vulnerable, and her eyes held the particular strain that came from watching family dynamics she couldn't quite understand. I wanted to apologize, Amy said quietly, taking the seat David offered her. For my father bringing me here, for Marcus's behavior, for... She gestured helplessly. I'm not sure exactly what I'm apologizing for, but this whole situation feels wrong. What feels wrong about it, dear? Aliana studied the young woman carefully. The way Marcus talks about your career, about teaching. Amy's voice grew stronger as she found her footing. My mother was a teacher before she married my father, high school mathematics. She always said teaching was the most important work anyone could do because it shaped everything that came after. She paused, then added quietly, she would have hated hearing Marcus talk about it the way he did today. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Aliana said gently. She was. She died 5 years ago. Amy's composure wavered slightly. She always said that people who dismiss education are usually the ones who need it the most. David smiled for the first time since the afternoon's confrontations began. Your mother and my wife would have gotten along well. The thing is, Amy continued, her gaze moving between them, I have this feeling that there's more to your story than Marcus realizes. The way you carry yourself, the way you listen to conversations about law and business, you don't act like someone whose expertise ended with lesson plans and parent conferences. She leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Milestonebrown, I don't think you're just a retired teacher. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of secrets that were growing harder to maintain. Downstairs, Marcus's voice continued its relentless self-promotion, while Jessica's responses grew increasingly terse. Uncle Frank's weathered voice joined the conversation, carrying the authority of someone who'd finally decided to speak his mind. Aliana looked at this perceptive young woman, then at David's.
The morning air was crisp with the promise of another scorching day. But for now, the world held that perfect temperature that made October mornings in rural Pennsylvania feel like a gift. Aliana wrapped Eleanor's hand-knitted shawl around her shoulders and set off down the gravel path that led to the old stone bridge spanning Miller's Creek. This had been her refuge during childhood visits, back when Eleanor's grandparents still owned the farm and young Aliana would spend summers here, escaping the cramped city apartment where her widowed mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Even then, Aliana had been the serious one, the child who preferred books to playground games, who asked too many questions and remembered too many details. She could still picture 8-year-old Marcus, all knees and elbows and desperate energy, following her around like an eager puppy during those long-ago summers. He'd been 6 years younger then, gap-toothed and hero-worshipping, hanging on her every word as she read him stories from the library books she'd packed alongside her few summer clothes. Aliana's going to be somebody important someday, Eleanor's grandmother used to say, watching the serious girl with the careful handwriting and the insatiable curiosity. Mark my words, that child's got steel in her spine. Marcus had heard those predictions, had watched the adults' faces when they talked about Aliana's potential. Even at 6, he'd understood that expectations were a finite resource in their family, and if all the hope was being invested in his brilliant older cousin, what did that leave for him? The memory still carried the sting of recognition. She'd been 22 when Marcus graduated high school, already 3 years into law school, when he'd announced his intention to follow her path. "If Aliana can do it," he'd said with the careless confidence of 18, "how hard can it be?" She tried to mentor him during those early years, to share the lessons she'd learned about the law's demands and rewards. But Marcus wanted shortcuts where none existed, recognition without sacrifice, success without the grinding years of proving himself in unglamorous assignments. When he'd finally found his footing in corporate law, surrounding himself with the trappings of wealth and status, she thought he'd found peace with his own path. Yesterday's performance suggested otherwise. The stone bridge held her weight as surely as it had 40 years ago, though her bones now protested the uneven surface. She settled onto the familiar perch where she'd spent countless mornings during those transformative summers, watching the water flow past while wrestling with questions too large for a child's understanding. From this vantage point, she could see Richard Chen pacing near the barn, his phone pressed to his ear, his body language broadcasting anxiety even from a distance. His voice didn't carry clearly across the morning air, but the urgency in his movements was unmistakable. "Don't care what it costs," she caught during a moment when the wind shifted in her direction. "Federal court on Monday. Judge Hartwell. Reputation for being tough." The fragment sent ice through her veins. Judge Hartwell. Monday morning. Federal court. In all her years on the bench, Aliana had cultivated the discipline of mental compartmentalization, the ability to separate her personal life from her professional responsibilities. But Marcus's client, the man who spent yesterday evening listening to condescending remarks about retired teachers and their limited understanding of complex legal matters, was apparently scheduled to appear before her bench in less than 48 hours. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Chen's pacing intensified, his voice rising enough for her to catch additional fragments. Securities fraud charges. SEC investigation. Need every advantage. Securities fraud. The pieces clicked into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed legal argument. Richard Chen wasn't just facing regulatory compliance issues. He was the defendant in United States v. Chen Enterprises, the case that had been dominating her calendar preparation for the past month. A complex prosecution involving alleged manipulation of development contracts, falsified environmental reports, and investor fraud totaling nearly $50 million. She'd spent weeks reviewing the evidence, studying the prosecution's case, preparing for what promised to be a high-profile trial that would test the boundaries of federal jurisdiction in corporate fraud cases. And now the defendant was sleeping under the same roof, having spent the evening listening to her great-nephew dismiss her intelligence and significance? The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted her spinning thoughts. David appeared around the bend in the path, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. His silver hair tousled for sleep, but his dark eyes alert with concern. "Thought I might find you here," he said gently, settling beside her on the stone bridge with the careful movements of someone whose joints had also accumulated decades of wear. "Couldn't sleep?" "Too much thinking," Aliana admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The mug warmed her hands, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with the morning air. David followed her gaze toward the barn, where Chen continued his anxious phone conversation. "He's been at it for 20 minutes, David observed. Whatever his legal troubles are, they're serious enough to warrant early morning crisis management." "David, I think I know what case he's involved in." She explained her growing suspicion, watching her husband's expression shift from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. David had been a prosecutor long enough to understand the ethical implications of a judge presiding over a case involving someone from her personal life, however tangential the connection. "You'll have to recuse yourself," he immediately said. "Even if the connection is just through Marcus, the appearance of impropriety—" "I know," Aliana interrupted softly. "But David, think about what that means. Marcus brought his client to our family gathering specifically to show off his importance, his connections, his success. If I recuse myself from Chen's case, Questions will be asked. The nature of my relationship to the defendant will become part of the court record. The implications hung between them like morning mist. Recusal would require explanation. Explanation would reveal my true identity. The careful fiction I'd maintained for over a decade would collapse in a single legal filing. Maybe it's time, David said gently. Maybe this is the universe telling you that secrets this big can't be kept forever. From the house came the sound of a screen door closing, followed by Uncle Frank's weathered voice calling across the yard, "Jen, you're going to wear a hole in that ground. Come get some coffee before Eleanor starts worrying about you." Chen's conversation ended abruptly, his phone disappearing into his jacket pocket as he forced his features into a semblance of calm. But even from their distance, Aliana could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved like a man carrying invisible weight. "He's scared," she observed quietly. "Really scared. That's not the behavior of someone facing routine regulatory issues." "No," David agreed. "That's the behavior of someone who knows he's guilty and is running out of options." As they walked back toward the house, where the sounds of Eleanor's breakfast preparations were already beginning, Aliana found herself wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Her entire judicial philosophy was built on the principle that justice was blind, that the law applied equally regardless of personal connections, wealth, or social status. But what happened when personal connections threatened to compromise that blindness? More troubling still was the realization that Marcus's condescending dismissal of her abilities wasn't just personally hurtful, it was professionally relevant. If Chen believed she was nothing more than a retired teacher whose opinion carried no weight, how would that affect his trial strategy? Would he underestimate the judge presiding over his case, making crucial errors that could impact the outcome? The ethical implications were staggering, but so was the poetic justice. Marcus had spent years assuming he was the only legal mind in the family worth respecting. Richard Chen had chosen his representation based on that assumption. Now both men were about to learn that power and wisdom didn't always announce themselves with expensive suits and gleaming automobiles. As they approached the house, where the sounds of Eleanor's breakfast preparations were already beginning, Aliana made a decision that would change everything. The truth could no longer be contained, not when justice itself hung in the balance. The only question remaining was whether she would control the revelation, or whether Monday morning's court session would do it for her. Either way, the careful fiction of Aunt Aliana, the harmless retired teacher, was about to end. The Hartwell family's traditional Saturday evening talent show had been a reunion staple for 3 decades, transforming Eleanor's living room into an impromptu performance space where cousins recited poetry, uncles told elaborate stories, and children demonstrated everything from magic tricks to interpretive dance. What had begun as a way to entertain restless children during long family weekends had evolved into a cherished ritual that celebrated the simple joy of shared creativity. Aliana had always loved this tradition, remembering her own childhood performances when she'd recited entire passages from Jane Eyre with the passionate intensity of someone who believed literature could change the world. Tonight, however, she felt the familiar knot of dread that had been building since her dawn revelation about Richard Chen's true identity. The living room buzzed with comfortable chaos as extended family members arranged themselves on Eleanor's vintage furniture and borrowed folding chairs. Children claimed prime spots on the braided rug, while adults settled into the familiar hierarchy of family gatherings, Eleanor in her hostess throne, Uncle Frank in his customary corner, where he could observe without being observed.
Marcus rose with the fluid confidence of someone comfortable commanding attention, his craft beer held like a scepter of casual authority. Thank you, Mom. You know, having Richard here this weekend has reminded me how fortunate our family has been, how far we've all come from our humble beginnings. The words carried that particular tone Aliana had learned to recognize, the sound of Marcus positioning himself as the family's ambassador to success, the bridge between their simple origins and the sophisticated world he now inhabited. When I look around this room, Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across faces that ranged from curious to cautious, I see generations of honest, hard-working people who built their lives on simple values. People like Uncle Frank, who worked with his hands for 40 years and never complained. People like my mother, who raised 2 children while running a household on a teacher's salary. Uncle Frank's weathered face remained impassive, but Aliana caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he sensed where this performance was heading. And people like Aunt Aliana, Marcus's voice took on patronizing warmth reserved for beloved but limited relatives, who dedicated 4 decades to shaping young minds, teaching them the fundamentals of language and literature. Noble work, important work, but work that requires a certain contentment with modest expectations. The living room's comfortable buzz began to fade into something more attentive and uncomfortable. Amy Chen shifted in her chair, her expression darkening with recognition of the tone she'd heard before. "The thing is," Marcus continued, warming to his theme like a prosecutor presenting his closing argument, "success means different things to different people. For some, it means the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a comfortable retirement, the knowledge that you've contributed in your small way to society's foundation." His pause was perfectly timed, allowing the implicit contrast to build tension in the room. But for others, and I include Richard in this category, success means something more ambitious. It means building enterprises that employ thousands, creating wealth that transforms communities, navigating legal complexities that would overwhelm most people. It means operating at a level where million-dollar decisions are made daily, where federal regulations and constitutional law intersect with global markets. David's grip on Aliana's hand had tightened to the point of discomfort, but she barely noticed. The familiar burn of injustice was rising in her chest, the same fire that had driven her through decades of fighting for truth in courtrooms where powerful men assumed their voices mattered more than evidence. "Now, I'm not comparing these different types of success," Marcus said with the false modesty of someone absolutely making exactly that comparison. "Teaching high school students about metaphors and essay structure is valuable work. But when federal prosecutors are breathing down your neck, when SEC investigators are demanding documentation that could make or break a multi-billion-dollar enterprise," he gestured toward Chen with the pride of a knight presenting his rescued maiden, "well, that's when you need someone who understands how power actually works in this country." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut flesh. Eleanor's face had gone pale, her hostess' smile frozen in place like a mask someone had forgotten to remove. Jessica looked mortified, her hands clenched in her lap with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "Marcus," Uncle Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd reached his limit, "that's enough." But Marcus was beyond hearing warnings, intoxicated by what he clearly perceived as his audience's rapt attention. "I'm just being honest about—" "You're being cruel," Amy Chen interrupted, her young voice carrying more moral authority than Marcus's polished presentation. "You're being unnecessarily cruel to someone who doesn't deserve it." Richard Chen looked like he wanted to disappear into Eleanor's floral upholstery, his earlier anxiety now compounded by social mortification. "Perhaps we should—" "No," Uncle Frank said, rising from his corner chair with the deliberate movements of someone who'd finally decided to act. "Let's talk about honest work for a minute. Let's talk about the people who spend their lives building something besides their own bank accounts." The confrontation Aliana had been dreading was finally erupting, but not in the way she'd expected. Instead of her own dignity being defended, she watched her family rally around the principles Marcus had so casually dismissed. The irony was bitter as medicinal tea. They were defending her honor while having no idea of her true accomplishments. But perhaps, she realized as she watched Uncle Frank prepare to deliver what promised to be a devastating rebuttal to Marcus's arrogance, that was exactly the point. Her family's love and respect had never been contingent on her professional achievements. They were defending her because she was family, because she'd earned their affection through decades of kindness and presence, not because of any title or position. The revelation of her true identity, when it came, would only confirm what they already knew, that worth wasn't measured in billable hours or client fees, but in the daily choice to serve something larger than oneself. Marcus, however, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The aftermath of Marcus's cruel public performance hung over the Hartwell household like smoke from a dying fire, acrid, inescapable, and leaving everyone with stinging eyes and difficulty breathing normally. Aliana had retreated to the front porch swing, seeking the cool night air and the familiar rhythm of creaking chains that had soothed 3 generations of family troubles. At 78, she'd weathered countless storms, professional challenges that would have broken younger spirits, personal losses that had reshaped her understanding of resilience, and judicial decisions that carried the weight of lives hanging in the balance. But sitting in the darkness with Marcus's words echoing in her memory, she felt a weariness that reached deeper than physical exhaustion. 40 years of grading papers and managing classroom behavior, she whispered to the night air, testing how the dismissal felt when spoken out loud. The words tasted bitter as unsweetened medicine, reducing a lifetime of intellectual achievement to clerical drudgery. David emerged from the house carrying 2 glasses of Eleanor's homemade lemonade, his face set in the grim lines of someone exercising extraordinary restraint. He settled beside her on the swing with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested sudden motion, though his tension had nothing to do with physical discomfort. "Eleanor is in the kitchen crying," he reported quietly. "Uncle Frank is delivering what sounds like a lecture on basic human decency to our young peacock, and Jessica locked herself in the bathroom. I could hear her sobbing through the door." Aliana accepted the lemonade gratefully, though she doubted anything could wash the taste of humiliation from her mouth. And Marcus? He's completely oblivious to the damage he's caused. He keeps insisting he was being realistic about professional hierarchies and that everyone's overreacting. David's voice carried the controlled fury of someone whose protective instincts had been activated. "Aliana, I can't watch this anymore. I'm going to tell them." "David, no." He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes reflecting 40 years of partnership and understanding. "I've watched you endure condescension from people who aren't fit to carry your judicial robes. I've seen you maintain dignity in situations that would have broken lesser people. But this," he gestured toward the house where raised voices suggested Uncle Frank's lecture was intensifying. "This is family. This is supposed to be where you're safe." Through the screen door, they could hear Marcus's voice rising in defensive irritation. "I don't understand why everyone's so upset. I was explaining the difference between academic theory and practical application. Richard needed to understand..." What Richard needed, Uncle Frank's weathered voice cut through the objection like a blade through silk, was to see how this family treats people with respect. Instead, he got a masterclass from arrogance from someone who's forgotten where he came from. "I haven't forgotten anything," Marcus protested. "I'm proud of this family, proud of our roots. That doesn't mean I have to pretend that all careers are equally challenging or equally important." The sound of a chair scraping against hardwood suggested someone had stood up abruptly. "Equally important?" Uncle Frank's voice carried decades of accumulated wisdom and no small amount of anger. "Son, let me tell you about important. Important is the teacher who saw potential in a scared kid from the wrong side of town and stayed after school every day for a month to help him catch up. Important is the person who shapes minds and hearts for 40 years without expecting thanks or recognition. That's very noble, Uncle Frank, but I'm not finished." The authority in Frank's voice was absolute. "Important is someone who chooses service over profit, principle over prestige. Important is building something that lasts longer than a quarterly earnings report."
Aliana felt tears threatening for the first time since Marcus's performance began. Her family was defending her honor with a ferocity that spoke to values deeper than professional achievement. They didn't know about the constitutional precedents she'd set, the corporate criminal.
Eleanor's settled into one of Eleanor's wicker chairs, her movements suggesting someone grateful for the refuge of quiet conversation. My father's been impossible all week. Phone calls at all hours, meetings with lawyers, this constant anxiety about Monday's court appearance. She paused, then added with the honesty of youth, I think he's genuinely scared for the first time in his life. David's attention sharpened. Monday's court appearance? Federal court in Philadelphia, Amy confirmed. Some kind of fraud charges related to his development business. He keeps talking about how Judge Hartwell has a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime, how she doesn't show favoritism to wealthy defendants. Amy's voice carried a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. I think that's why he wanted to come here, to get away from the pressure for a few days. The lemonade glass slipped from Aliana's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the porch floorboards with the sound like breaking crystal. David was beside her instantly, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes searching her face with growing alarm. Aliana? His voice carried 40 years of marriage in its concern. Judge Hartwell, Monday morning, federal court in Philadelphia. The pieces clicked into place with the inexorable logic of a judicial decision reaching its inevitable conclusion. Richard Chen wasn't just any defendant facing federal charges. He was her defendant, scheduled to appear before her bench in less than 48 hours for the pre-trial hearing that would set the tone for his entire prosecution. The irony was so complete, it almost defied belief. The man who'd spent the evening listening to Marcus dismiss her intelligence and significance was about to place his freedom in her hands. The client Marcus had brought here to showcase his own importance was the same defendant whose case had dominated Aliana's preparation for the past month. Mrs. Milestonebrown, Amy's voice carried growing concern as she watched Aliana's face drain of color. Are you all right? Aliana began, then stopped. How could she explain that the weekend's humiliations had just taken on dimensions that threatened the very foundations of judicial ethics? How could she describe the collision of personal and professional that made her great-nephew's condescension not just hurtful, but potentially relevant to a federal criminal case? From inside the house came the sound of Richard Chen's voice, strained and urgent as he fielded another late-night phone call. Don't care what it costs. Judge Hartwell has a reputation for being tough but fair. If we can present the right narrative, show the right character witnesses. Character witnesses. Aliana closed her eyes as the full scope of the ethical disaster became clear. Chen was discussing trial strategy for a case she would preside over, seeking character references that might influence the very judge who'd spent the evening listening to him dismiss education and public service as unimportant. David, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the night sounds of rural Pennsylvania. We have to leave, tonight, right now. Aliana, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, she replied, her judicial training already calculating the steps required to address this unprecedented situation. I've seen the future, and it's going to require explanations I'm not ready to give. Amy leaned forward in her chair, her young face creased with confusion and concern. Mrs. Milestonebrown, is there something about my father's case that... There's something about everything, Aliana interrupted gently, rising from the swing with movements that suddenly felt every one of her 78 years. Amy, your father is about to learn that assumptions can be dangerous things, and my family... She paused, looking toward the house where Marcus's voice continued its defensive justifications. My family is about to learn that secrets this big have their own momentum. The breaking point had arrived not as an explosion, but as recognition, the understanding that some truths could no longer be contained by good intentions and family harmony. Monday morning's court session would demand answers,
and those answers would reshape every relationship she'd spent decades carefully maintaining. The only question remaining was whether she would control the revelation or let it control her. Either way, the fiction of Aunt Aliana, the harmless retired teacher, had approximately 36 hours left to live.
Chen's phone buzzed again, and this time he answered it despite Eleanor's gentle disapproval. Yes? What do you mean the character witnesses are concerned? Of course they're concerned. Everyone knows Judge Hartwell doesn't suffer fools gladly. His voice rose slightly as his anxiety overrode his social awareness. She sent Morrison to federal prison for 12 years, and he had twice our resources. This woman doesn't care about your connections or your charity donations. She cares about the law, period. Aliana felt the blood drain from her face as Chen continued his desperate phone conversation. The Morrison case, she remembered it vividly. Remembered the defendant's smug confidence during the first day of trial, his obvious belief that his expensive legal team could manipulate the system to his advantage. She'd taken particular satisfaction in delivering the sentence that had wiped that arrogance from his face. Judge Hartwell built her reputation on being absolutely incorruptible, Chen was saying, his voice carrying across the dining room despite his apparent attempt to speak quietly. 40 years of public service, most of it in the federal system. She started as a prosecutor, worked her way up through merit appointments, never showed favoritism to wealthy defendants. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. No, there's no angle to work, no political connections, no social obligations. She's what they call an old-school jurist. Evidence and law, nothing else matters. The irony was so complete, it left Aliana momentarily speechless. Chen was describing her judicial philosophy with an accuracy that Marcus, for all his legal expertise, had never demonstrated. This man understood exactly who would be presiding over his case, understood the principles that had guided her career, recognized the very qualities that Marcus had spent the weekend dismissing as unimportant. 40 years of public service. Uncle Frank repeated slowly, his keen eyes moving between Chen's anxious phone conversation and Aliana's increasingly pale face. That's interesting timing, isn't it? Amy Chen had been quiet throughout dinner, but now she leaned forward with the sudden attention of someone connecting disparate pieces. Mrs. Milestonebrown, didn't you mention that you'd worked in government service for about that long? The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy, significant, and impossible to ignore. David's hand found Aliana's under the table, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture of support that somehow made the moment both more bearable and more terrifying. Different kinds of service, Aliana managed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. The federal system is complex. Chen ended his phone call and returned his attention to the table, apparently unaware of the charged atmosphere his conversation had created. I apologize for the interruption. It's just that tomorrow's hearing could determine everything. Judge Hartwell will set the tone for the entire trial, and if she forms the wrong impression... What kind of impression are you hoping to make? Eleanor asked gently, her maternal instincts clearly troubled by her guest's obvious distress. Honestly, that I'm someone who deserves a second chance, someone who made mistakes but isn't fundamentally corrupt. Chen's voice carried the desperation of someone who'd finally realized the stakes. Marcus opened his mouth to offer what was undoubtedly more condescending advice about judicial psychology, but Uncle Frank's sharp look stopped him mid-breath. The old man's weathered face carried an expression of growing understanding, as if pieces of a long-standing puzzle were finally clicking into place. Respect, Uncle Frank said, slowly, his eyes never leaving Aliana's face. That's something that can't be faked, can it? Either you understand what real service looks like, or you don't. The stage was set for revelation, with Chen's desperate need to understand his judge colliding with Marcus's weekend of casual cruelty. Tomorrow's court appearance loomed like an approaching storm, carrying the power to transform everything these people thought they knew about justice, service, and the unassuming woman they dismissed as a harmless retired teacher. The truth could no longer be contained by good intentions and family loyalty. The only question was whether it would emerge through confession or recognition, and which would prove more devastating to the constructed fiction that had sustained them all. The moment that would reshape everything began with Richard Chen's trembling fingers as he pulled out his phone, his face pale with the kind of desperation that comes from running out of options.
The formal dinner had dissolved into uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the tick of Eleanor's grandfather clock and the distant sound of dishes being cleared in the kitchen. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he scrolled through his phone with movements that betrayed his agitation. "Maybe you can help me understand what I'm up against." Marcus leaned forward eagerly, his earlier defensiveness giving way to the professional curiosity of someone who thrived on complex legal challenges. "Richard, whatever it is, we can work through it. I've dealt with federal judges before. They're just people, after all." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," he murmured, his fingers still working across the screen. "People who can see through every facade, every carefully constructed defense." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Here. This is what ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer yesterday." He turned the phone toward the table, and Aliana felt time slow to crawl as she saw her own face staring back at her, the official judicial portrait that had been taken 3 years ago, her expression serious and dignified beneath the caption, "Judge Aliana Milestonebrown to preside over high-profile corporate fraud case." The silence that followed was absolute, as if someone had suddenly drained all the air from Eleanor's dining room. Uncle Frank's weathered hand stilled on his coffee cup. Eleanor's eyes moved between the phone screen and Aliana's face, with the growing recognition of someone solving a puzzle that had been in front of her all along. Marcus, whose face changed from confusion to horror, and finally complete devastation that seemed to age him a decade within the span of heartbeats. "No," he whispered, the word escaping like air. "No, that's not... Aunt Aliana doesn't..." His voice trailed off as the evidence of his own eyes overwhelmed his ability to deny reality. Chen's gaze moved between the phone screen and Aliana's face with the horrified fascination of someone watching their worst nightmare unfold in real time. "Judge Aliana Milestonebrown," he breathed, and the formal address fell into the family dining room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through every person present. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, her hand flying to cover her mouth as the full scope of her husband's weekend performance came crashing down on her. "Oh my God, Marcus, what have you done?" Amy Chen had gone white as parchment, her young face reflecting the mortification of someone who just realized her father had been insulting the very person who held her fate in her hands. "Dad, please, tell me you didn't know." But Chen couldn't respond. He was staring at Aliana with the expression of a drowning man watching his life preserver sail away. The polished businessman who had spent the weekend making polite conversation about rural family traditions had just discovered he'd been sharing a roof with the federal judge who would determine whether he spent the next decade in prison. Eleanor found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Aliana, you're really a federal judge?" Aliana looked around the table at faces ranging from shocked to horrified to devastated, and felt a strange sense of relief washing over her. The carefully maintained fiction was finally crumbling, and despite the chaos it would bring, there was something liberating about the truth finally demanding its due.
"Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in federal courtrooms for decades. "I'm Judge Aliana Milestonebrown of the Third Circuit Court. And Mr. Chen..." She turned to face the man who'd spent 3 days listening to her great-nephew dismiss her intelligence and significance. "You're scheduled to appear before my bench tomorrow morning for your pre-trial hearing." Marcus made a sound that was part groan, part sob. His carefully constructed image as the family's legal expert had just collapsed so thoroughly that Aliana almost felt sorry for him. Almost. 40 years! Uncle Frank said slowly, his weathered face breaking into something that might have been a smile. 40 years of federal service, and you let us think you were just a retired teacher. "I was protecting my privacy," Aliana replied gently, "and perhaps protecting all of you from the complications that come with having a federal judge in the family." Chen's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against Eleanor's good china with a sound like breaking dreams. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped, his legal training warring with his social confusion about how to address a federal judge in her great-niece's dining room. "Mrs. Milestonebrown will do fine," Aliana said with dry humor, "though I suspect this conversation is going to require some significant ethical consultations before tomorrow morning." The full implications were beginning to dawn on everyone simultaneously. Marcus had spent 3 days condescending to one of the most powerful jurists in the federal system, Chan had discussed trial strategy in front of the judge who would preside over his case. The weekend's casual cruelties had just taken on the weight of potential judicial misconduct. "I have to recuse myself," Aliana said quietly, her judicial training already working through the necessary steps. "There's no question about that. But the explanations required, well, let's just say this particular secret was apparently too big to keep indefinitely." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came cracked and broken. "Aunt Aliana, I didn't know. I never meant—" "You meant exactly what you said, Marcus," she replied, with the quiet firmness that had made her legendary among court officers. "The question now is what you're going to do with the knowledge of who you are really talking to. The revelation had transformed everything, but the reckoning was only just beginning." The aftermath of revelation settled over the Hartwell household like dust after an explosion. Everything familiar suddenly transformed, every relationship requiring reassessment in light of truths that could no longer be hidden. Aliana sat in Eleanor's living room at 6 o'clock Monday morning, already dressed in the understated gray suit she would wear to court, watching the sunrise paint the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of gold and possibility. Richard Chen had departed before dawn, his expensive luggage hastily packed, his farewell limited to a stiff handshake and a formal "Your Honor" that carried the weight of 30 years of legal training. His departure had been accompanied by a flurry of phone calls to his legal team, emergency motions for judicial recusal, and the kind of crisis management that came with having your weekend host turn out to be the federal judge presiding over your criminal case. "The ethics committee is going to have a field day with this one," David observed, settling beside Aliana with 2 cups of coffee. "Though, I have to admit, there's something poetic about Chen learning exactly who he'd been dismissing all weekend. The recusal motion will be granted, of course. Judge Martinez can take the case. She's been handling similar corporate fraud prosecutions for years. Chen will get a fair trial, just not from me." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, but carrying herself with newfound dignity. "Aliana, honey," she said softly, settling into her favorite armchair, "I owe you an apology. I spent decades thinking I knew who you were, what you'd accomplished. I made assumptions based on my own limited understanding of what success looks like." Uncle Frank emerged from the kitchen with his morning coffee, his weathered face reflecting deep satisfaction. "Been telling people for years that Aliana was something special. The way she listened to legal conversations, the way she never seemed impressed by Marcus's big talk. Nobody retires at 75 unless they're doing something more interesting than grading papers." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Marcus appeared looking like he'd aged a decade overnight, his usually perfect appearance disheveled from a sleepless night of reckoning. Jessica followed, her expression protective but determined. "Aunt Aliana," Marcus began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and genuine remorse, I have to apologize for something that seems impossible to apologize for." "Sit down, Marcus," Aliana said gently, her tone carrying family love rather than judicial authority. "We need to talk." Marcus collapsed into the nearest chair. "I've been awake all night trying to figure out how to apologize for spending 3 days insulting someone whose professional achievements make my entire career look like amateur hour." "You start by acknowledging that the insults weren't really about me," Aliana replied with the wisdom of someone who'd spent 40 years observing human nature. "They were about your own insecurity, your need to diminish others to feel important. The fact that I happened to be a federal judge was irrelevant. You would have been equally cruel if I really had been a retired teacher." "That almost makes it worse," Marcus whispered.
Jessica moved to stand behind his husband's chair. We've been talking about this all night, about how success became more important to Marcus than character, how winning became more important than kindness. Amy Chen appeared in the doorway, unsure of her welcome. Judge Milestonebrown, I wanted to thank you before I leave for showing me what real dignity looks like, even when people are being cruel. Your father is going to face justice in my colleague's courtroom, where he'll be judged on evidence and law rather than assumptions about worth, Aliana said gently. And Marcus is going to face some justice of his own, Eleanor added with maternal authority, starting with some serious reflection on what kind of man he wants to be going forward. The morning sun had fully risen now, transforming the familiar farmhouse into something new, a place where truth had finally been allowed to flourish, where secrets had given way to understanding, where family love had proven stronger than professional pretense. I should probably start using my real title at family gatherings, she said with dry humor that drew smiles from everyone, except for Marcus, who was still processing his humiliation. Judge Aunt Aliana has a nice ring to it, Uncle Frank observed with satisfaction. As the family began rebuilding their understanding of each other, Aliana felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The burden of maintaining false modesty was gone, replaced by the freedom to be fully herself, federal judge and beloved family member, constitutional scholar and Eleanor's great-niece, judicial authority and David's devoted wife. The weekend had cost her a case and created an ethical crisis requiring careful management. But it had also given her something invaluable, the knowledge that her family's love had never been contingent on her professional achievements, and that truth, however painful its emergence, was always preferable to the exhausting performance of false humility. Marcus would have to rebuild his relationship with his own integrity. Chen would face justice in another courtroom, and Aliana Milestonebrown would return to Philadelphia knowing she no longer had to choose between her professional identity and her personal relationships. The gavel had fallen on more than just a weekend reunion. It had fallen on a lifetime of unnecessary secrets, clearing the way for something far more valuable, the simple truth of who she really was. Justice had many faces, sometimes appearing in federal courtrooms robed in constitutional authority, sometimes in rural farmhouses dressed in morning light and family love. Both were equally powerful, equally necessary, and both could finally coexist in the life of one remarkable woman who'd learned that the greatest strength came not from hiding her accomplishments, but from allowing them to stand alongside her humanity. The reunion was over, but the real family gathering, built on truth rather than assumption, was just beginning. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.